John Gartner here, and welcome to my sake education video series. Today I want to talk about sake rice, and this will be the first in a series of short videos on that subject. So to begin, sake is made from rice, but there are many kinds of rice, and some are much more suited to sake brewing than others. So today, in particular, I want to talk about sake rice versus regular rice, or eating rice, or, if I can coin the term, table rice. First, a couple of hugely basic points. Sake is brewed, not simply fermented and not distilled, from rice and rice alone. Rice is a grain, and so it has lots of starch in it, but no sugar. So that starch must first be converted into sugar via enzymes from the koji. Rice in Japan is planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. Now this could mean from April to August, or it could be from June to November. It depends on the strain of rice. Most sake rice is planted and harvested later than most table rice, but there are exceptions. For this discussion, there are two major points with which to begin. The first of those is, more than anything else, rice leads to flavor, but nothing exists in a vacuum. In other words, the choice of rice in making sake will affect flavor a lot. However, many other things will affect flavor as well. And the choice of rice will affect many other things besides flavor. However, to oversimplify just a bit, more than anything else, rice leads to flavor. The second big point is related to the first, and may seem somewhat of a contradiction, but although the choice of rice and flavor are connected, the connection between the choice of rice and the flavor in the final sake is not nearly as tight as the connection between the choice of grapes and the final flavor in a wine. Why is that? Because between the time the rice gets into the brewery and the time it's converted into sake, a whole lot of things happen to the rice along the way. And to some degree, these things will supersede the choice of rice. So the connection between the rice and the final sake is not nearly as tight as the connection between the choice of grapes and the final wine. Having said that, the choice of sake rice is extremely important. And we'll come back to that in a bit more detail in a little while, but I wanted to get those two ground rules out of the way. Next, we have a potential misunderstanding to address, and that's this. Most sake on the market is actually not made with proper sake rice, but with regular table rice. Premium sake, however, is almost always made with proper sake rice, which is known as shuzo kotekimai. Again, most sake is not made with proper sake rice. Even premium sake like ginjo and dai ginjo can be made with table rice. However, even though it can legally be made from table rice, premium sake is almost always made with proper sake rice. We'll come back to some of this again later in the video, but those are the major points with which I wanted to begin today. Next, getting back to sake rice versus regular table rice. Sake rice is actually an official certification by the government, and currently there are about 120 types of sake rice, officially registered sake rice. Sake rice is officially known as shuzo kotekimai, and it's different. It's different from regular table rice in a handful of ways. Let's look at some of those differences now. The first major difference is size. Sake rice is larger than table rice, and this refers to both the size of the rice stalks when it's growing and the size of the individual grains. On the average, sake rice stalks are about 25% taller than table rice stalks, and accordingly this makes it more difficult to grow and more difficult to harvest. In some cases, but not always, the sake rice stalks are so tall that they cannot be harvested by combine, by machine, and therefore must be harvested by hand. The next difference between sake rice and table rice is that sake rice has more starch in it and less fat and protein in it than regular table rice does. Remember that starch will eventually be converted into sugar and sugar into alcohol, so starch is good for sake rice. Fat and protein, on the other hand, can lead to off flavors in the final sake. So for proper sake rice, we want a higher starch content and a lower fat and protein content. Note, too, that fat and protein can actually contribute to flavor in a positive way for table rice. However, for sake rice, we want lower fat and protein content and a higher starch content, which is what sake rice gives us. Next, in sake rice, the starch that we want so badly is physically concentrated in the center of the grain, with fat and protein around that on the outside. In table rice, the starch, fat, and protein are a little bit more mixed up than they are in sake rice, where you have a white starch packet in the center of the grain, and fat and protein found outside of that hovering near the surface of the grain. What's advantageous about this is that, remember, we want the starch, we don't want the fat and protein. So all you have to do, ostensibly, is mill away the outside of the grain and you take away the fat and protein and leave only the starch behind. The white starchy center in grains of sake rice is known as the Shinpaku and is written for the characters for white and heart. And again, this Shinpaku is where all the starches are with fat and protein around that. The Shinpaku, or starchy center, is actually very often visible to the naked eye, even to those of us that are not rice farmers. And also, very commonly, the quality of a sake rice is assessed by what percentage of the grains actually have a visible Shinpaku. Next, another difference between sake rice and table rice is price. In short, sake rice is much more expensive than table rice. While of course there's variations for both, sake rice can be 2 to 3 times more expensive than regular table rice. I want to go back a moment and cover something very important about sake brewing: rice milling. The main objective of milling the rice before brewing is to remove fats and proteins that are close to the surface of the rice grains, because if in excess, those fats and proteins lead to rough flavors and less refinement in the final sake. This point has led to the commonly held rule of thumb that more milling is better. In truth, more milling will lead to lighter, more refined sake, although there are limitations to this too. So, in a technical sense, and only to a certain point, more milling is better in that it leads to lighter and more refined sake. And it is true that the various grades of sake are legally defined in part by how much the rice has been milled before the brewing began. So it is indeed important, but that does not mean that more milling is unequivocally better, nor that it leads to sake that everyone prefers. Do keep that point in mind. Next, a couple of secondary points about sake rice. Another term for sake rice that's a bit more flexible than the shuzoko tekimai term is sakamai. Strictly speaking, they are not exactly the same, but very commonly we hear sakamai and shuzoko tekimai used somewhat interchangeably. Japan has 47 prefectures. A prefecture is about the size of a county and just about as autonomous. Almost all prefectures grow a little bit of sakamai. Tokyo, Okinawa, and Kagoshima are 3 exceptions, but almost all prefectures grow a little bit of sake rice. Obviously, some grow much more than others do. And lastly, almost all sake rice is the result of crossbreeding. There are a couple of pure heirloom strains out there, but almost all sake rice is crossbred to be more manageable, harvestable, or suited to the local climate. Obviously, a lot of experimentation and research goes into this, and every year new sake rices come out while others fade into relative oblivion. So those are the basics of sake rice. In a subsequent video, I'll talk a bit more about some advanced aspects of sake rice. And after that, we'll go on to look at the various major sake rices and what makes them what they are. Until next time, thanks for watching and listening, and kanpai.